And to your point, leadership needs to really be human-centered in ways that it's been talked about in leadership circles for quite a while now, for a few decades. The idea that what do leaders do? What do they provide, right? They provide the coaching, the ability to grow, and as a professional, leaders provide vision, right? The idea of where are we going as an organization? How am I growing within this organization? And they provide safety. Leaders provide the psychological safety for folks to really feel like I can authentically show up and reach my full potential and demonstrate that and contribute greatly to where we're going. But those concepts have been present for a while, but they've been largely ignored until the last couple of years, when the realities of really being human-centered have been brought to the forefront. And that's why it's important that now is the time for leaders to seize this moment and to adopt new paradigms on how we show up and how we do things. It's going to require leaders to grow, to continue to learn. We are leading human beings, which, as human beings, our issues and our needs continue to evolve in a rapidly evolving world. As human beings, we are not one-dimensional, right? And we talk about this a lot in cultures too, that we're not one-dimensional. And if you imagine, the human experience in terms of intellectual and emotional and physical needs and spiritual needs, those four components are typically separated, right? In terms of how we approach people and how we approach workers. You have to show up physically to do the work, regardless of how you're dealing, emotionally. And it almost seems like we take this concept that if you had these four different vessels of, physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, and each of those vessels had, stuff pouring into it, either positive or negative in our lives, that somehow we can compartmentalize and say, well, I might have these emotional issues going on in these really difficult circumstances with a beloved family member who's dealing with a health crisis or what have you, but leave that over there and come and just do your work. Rather than viewing us as one vessel that has these things pouring into us all the time, right? And at some point, it's going to affect us. It's going to impact us. And it requires leadership, as we talk about with education in the education world, that's culturally conscious, right? Culturally responsive. And that requires us to rehumanize our relationships with our workforce. It really requires us to take the extra effort to get to know each individual and their needs. And to your point earlier, Maria, it's the difference between equality and equity. Equity is providing what individuals need based on their individual circumstances, their talents, their skills, and what they bring to the table. And that takes work. And without that, if we're taking shortcuts and just demanding on the old models, we will not grow and we won't survive.
And from an equity lens, Roger, I'm curious to know what you think about this notion of leadership and emotional agility in terms of power dynamics and privilege, right? So I think leaders often, when I'm coaching executives, one of the things that I inevitably hear a lot of times is that leaders often believe that they're creating that psychological safety. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard leaders talk about how their team is like a family. And I'm like, families are dysfunctional. You don't want, don't compare your team to a family. Compare your team to a community or just a team. But when it comes to power dynamics and privilege, leaders are in an interesting position because they do hold responsibilities, they do have power, and yet sometimes that power can often create blind spots that makes it difficult for them to adjust or engage in that emotional agility and recognize the diverse needs of the unique individuals that are working with them. So what do you tell leaders to help them open themselves up to sort of navigate those challenges of power and privilege?
Well, I've worked with and been around leaders with a multitude of backgrounds and characteristics. I've worked with some leaders who were self-confident to a fault, almost suggesting that there was nothing new to learn. I've worked with leaders and seen leadership in other organizations that the leader might have considered themselves the smartest person in the room. And, your ideas might be important, but here's how we're moving forward. And on and on. There's different, dynamics at play. And I would just say that in order for these, new paradigms to really be embraced and move forward, leaders have to recognize that you are a lifelong learner in this process, that the best leadership style is one in which you prioritize listening and connecting and empathizing with the circumstances and realities and challenges facing individuals and workforces. It is leadership that really is visionary and understanding how to reach that end goal of the bottom line that you've set for yourself, but being willing to pivot along the way if things don't go according to plan. It's leadership that really prioritizes the core values of the community and the organization, and that the core values are not breached in pursuit of what the bottom line is. It takes leadership that values continuous growth, learning, and leading with integrity. Those are the abstract ways I would think I would really recommend for folks to really look at the impact that they can have as leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I would add to what you said too is we often talk about micro messages from a negative vantage point, right? Those microaggressions, those small, subtle, death by 1,000 paper cuts behaviors. We don't as frequently talk about the value and the importance of micro affirmations. And when leaders intentionally and consciously engage in small but not insignificant trust building behaviors, where they are frequently and regularly showing that they care about the individuals that are working with them, even something as simple as little displays of appreciation, picking up the phone and calling, not with a critique, but just a, how's it going and what do you need from me today? Our colleague Melissa always says snacks are good, right? but any sort of token of appreciation, I think is really important. It's not enough in and of itself. Saying thank you once is not enough, but building up that, the emotional bank account with our followers, I think as leaders is incredibly important. And to do it during the easy times as well as the hard times, not waiting until things become really challenging, but letting people know that they have that flexibility, that you're looking out for their best interests, that you see them as a core part of the organizational success, I think is so important.
Absolutely. I would say simultaneously, having the emotional intelligence to receive feedback as a leader, even feedback that might not be what you're wanting to hear, right? Especially about your leadership. And I think that's, oftentimes when leaders receive that type of feedback, there's not a pleasant response, right? And I think that's something that can be worked on as well, is receiving feedback in a way that is positive and productive, and sees it as an opportunity to grow as a leader. And I think that's another huge component of it. Oh, and the piece you've mentioned earlier as well, that, it takes being engaged. Leaders can absolutely be perceived and likely accurately perceived as being performative if the only time they engage in issues is when there's a crisis or there's a situation that affects the public image of an organization. Really being engaged in the issue means being really connected and really invested. Thank you for listening to the Culture Stew podcast. In a world full of podcasts and endless choices, we're especially grateful that you spent time with us.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Marukian.
And me, Roger Moriano, with operations support by Melissa Gratz.